The observation deck of the Zephyrian research vessel Astral Insight hummed with quiet efficiency as Commander Vexhai studied the tactical displays. 3 cycles ago, the hegemony had received distress signals from the mining colony on Kepler 442c. The transmissions spoke of raiders, ships bearing no identification, and desperate pleas for assistance. What made this particular incident noteworthy was the human response. Vexhai had spent the better part of his career studying the newer species that had recently joined the galactic community. The humans were fascinating subjects, bipedal mammals from a world they called Earth, with an unusual psychological makeup that defied most xenobiological models. Their planet was classified as a death world by galactic standard classification, though the humans seemed oblivious to this fact. They spoke casually of predators that could tear apart most sentient species, weather patterns that would devastate entire civilizations, and natural disasters they simply called Tuesday. The tactical officer, a crystalline Altarian named Kesha, chimed softly. "Commander, the human fleet has dropped out of hyperspace. 3 vessels. Designation appears to be military escort configuration." Vexhai's forearms moved across the control console with practiced precision. "Maintain position at safe observation distance. Begin recording all combat data. The Science Council wants comprehensive analysis of human military tactics." Through the viewport, he could see the human ships. They were smaller than expected, lacking the massive bulk typical of hegemony battleships. Where other species built vessels like floating fortresses, bristling with defensive arrays and redundant shielding systems, these human ships appeared almost skeletal by comparison. Their hulls were scarred and patched, suggesting they had seen considerable action. Most puzzling of all, they seemed to prioritize speed and maneuverability over protection. Scanning the raider positions, Kesha reported. 12 vessels, unknown configuration. They've taken position around the mining platform and are using it as cover. Standard piracy formation. They can fire on approaching ships while the platform prevents return fire on their position. It was a classic defensive strategy. Any attacking force would have to choose between destroying the very installation they came to save or accepting devastating losses while trying to disable the raiders without collateral damage. Most species would spend hours in tactical planning, bringing in specialized equipment, or simply writing off the colony as acceptable losses. The human response was immediate and utterly unexpected. The lead human vessel, identified as the Indomitable, began accelerating directly toward the raider formation. Not toward an optimal attack position, not in a flanking maneuver, but straight into the heart of the enemy defensive line. The other 2 ships followed in tight formation, their engines burning at what the Zephyrian sensors registered as dangerously high output levels. Are they malfunctioning? Vexhai wouldn't allow. Their approach vector is suicide. Kesha's crystalline form shimmered with confusion. "Sir, I'm reading massive electromagnetic signatures from the human ships. They appear to be charging their weapon systems, but the energy output is exceeding safe operating parameters by 300%. They're going to overload their own systems." "It would appear so, Commander." The first raider ships opened fire as the humans closed distance. Particle beams and plasma bolts streaked across space, impacting the human vessels. The lead ship's shields flared and collapsed within seconds. Instead of retreating or seeking cover, the human ship continued its charge. More impacts registered across its hull, tearing through armor plating and secondary systems. "Why aren't they retreating?" Vexhai asked, though he suspected no one had an answer. The human ships reached optimal firing range, and suddenly space erupted in violence. Every weapon system on all 3 vessels fired simultaneously, not the carefully coordinated volleys typical of civilized warfare, but a sustained, overwhelming barrage that turned the void into a storm of energy and metal. The humans weren't aiming for specific systems or trying to disable their opponents. They were simply pouring everything they had into their targets with the apparent goal of complete annihilation. 2 raider ships simply ceased to exist. vaporized in the first seconds of the engagement. A third lost power and began tumbling, its hull torn open like broken fruit. The remaining raiders, clearly unprepared for such ferocious aggression, scattered their formation. Impossible que ça whispered. They just took 12-3 odds and gained immediate superiority. But the humans weren't finished. The indomitable, now trailing atmosphere and debris from multiple hull breaches continued its attack run. Instead of pulling back to repair damage, it accelerated toward the largest raider vessel, firing continuously. The raider ship returned fire, scoring direct hits that should have crippled any reasonable opponent. The human ship kept coming. Commander, Kesha's voice carried a note of something approaching fear. The lead human vessel has lost primary life support, secondary weapons, and appears to have fires burning on 3 decks. They're still attacking. Vexhai watched in horrified fascination as the Indomitable closed with its target. At the last possible moment, he expected the human ship to veer off or launch missiles. Instead, it did something that violated every principle of civilized warfare he had ever studied. It rammed the raider vessel at full speed. The impact was devastating. Both ships crumpled and spun apart, but the raider vessel broke in half, its crew compartments venting into space. The Indomitable somehow held together, though it was clearly dying. Emergency lights flickered along its broken hull, and multiple sections showed signs of catastrophic decompression. "Give me a communication channel to the human vessels," Vexhai ordered. "They're going to need immediate assistance." Before Kesha could comply, the tactical display updated with new contacts. The remaining raider ships had regrouped and were moving to finish off the damaged human vessel. The other 2 human ships, both showing significant battle damage, moved to intercept. What followed defied every tactical doctrine in galactic hegemony military manuals. The humans didn't retreat. They didn't call for reinforcements. They didn't attempt to negotiate or withdraw to a safer position. Instead, they attacked with even greater ferocity than before. It was as if the damage to their lead ship had triggered some kind of berserker response in the entire human force. The second human ship, designation Relentless, had lost its primary weapons in the initial exchange. Rather than withdrawing, it began using its point defense lasers as primary weapons, firing them in continuous beams that carved through raider armor like industrial cutting tools. When those overloaded and burned out, the humans began launching everything they had: emergency flares, probe drones, even pieces of their own damaged hull plating, anything that could be turned into a projectile. The third vessel, Defiant, had taken a direct hit to its reactor core early in the fight. By all logical considerations, it should have been evacuated and abandoned. Instead, the humans appeared to be using the unstable reactor as a weapon, allowing it to build toward overload while they positioned themselves for maximum damage to enemy forces. They're going to detonate their own reactor, Vexhai realized. In the middle of combat. "That's impossible," Kesha replied. "No species would deliberately destroy their own vessel unless..." The Defiant exploded. The reactor detonation vaporized 2 raider ships instantly and sent lethal radiation washing over 3 more. In any other context, it would have been considered a tragic accident. But the timing, the positioning, the way the other human ships had cleared the blast zone moments before, it was clearly intentional. The surviving raiders broke formation and fled. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a regrouping maneuver, but full panic flight. Ships that had moments before been confident pirates were now running for their lives from an enemy that seemed willing to die rather than accept defeat. In the aftermath, as rescue operations began for the mining platform and the survivors of the Indomitable, Vexhai reviewed the combat recordings with growing unease. The human tactics made no sense according to established military doctrine. They had taken terrible losses, sacrificed valuable ships and equipment, and achieved their victory through what could only be described as controlled insanity. Yet they had won. A communication request came through from a human fleet commander. Vexhai accepted the transmission, expecting to speak with a wounded veteran or perhaps a fanatic. Instead, the hologram showed a middle-aged human female with graying hair and calm, intelligent eyes. This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Terran Defense Force. We appreciate your assistance during the engagement, though I notice you maintained observation distance throughout the combat. Admiral Chun, I am Commander Vexhai of the Galactic Hegemony. We were conducting observational research on human military tactics. Your methods are quite unlike anything in our databases. Admiral Chun smiled, and something in that expression sent a chill through Vexhai's nervous system. Commander, what you witnessed today was restraint. We had civilian lives to consider and property to protect. Had this been a direct threat to human colonies? She paused, her smile fading. Well, you wouldn't have seen anyone run. The transmission ended, leaving Vexhai staring at empty space. Restraint. The humans called that display of suicidal aggression restraint. As the astral insight prepared to depart, Kesha approached with a preliminary analysis. Commander, the combat effectiveness metrics don't make sense. By every calculation, the humans should have lost that engagement. Their ships were outgunned, outnumbered, and less heavily armored than their opponents. Yet they won decisively. Yes, sir. And, according to our psychological profiles, they weren't even particularly angry about the attack on the mining colony. The crew communications we intercepted suggest they considered this a routine patrol action. Vexhai looked out at the stars, each one potentially home to civilizations that had never encountered humans in combat. The Galactic Hegemony had protocols for dealing with aggressive species, containment, negotiation, economic pressure. But all of those approaches assumed the target species value their own survival above victory. What did you do with a species that viewed death as simply another tactical option? 3 months after the Kepler 442C incident, Commander Vexhai found himself aboard the Hegemony flagship Eternal Harmony, briefing the High Council on human military capabilities. The curved amphitheater held representatives from 47 different species, each contributing their perspective to the growing concern about Earth's children. The tactical analysis is complete, Vexhai announced, his 4 arms manipulating the holographic display that showed the battle data. Human combat doctrine appears to prioritize psychological warfare over conventional strategic thinking. They systematically violate established military principles, yet achieve consistent victories against superior forces. High Counselor Yithkar, a massive insectoid from the core worlds, clicked her mandibles in concern. Explain this violation of principles, Commander. They ignore force preservation. Most species consider their ships and personnel valuable resources to be protected. Humans seem to view them as expendable tools for achieving objectives. They will sacrifice strategic assets for tactical advantages and accept casualties that would cause other species to surrender. The hologram shifted to show recorded communications from a human fleet during the recent engagement. Vexhai activated the translation matrix, and the assembled council heard the calm, professional voices of the human crew as they coordinated their suicidal attack runs. Notice the emotional content. Vexhai continued. No fear, no hesitation, no discussion of alternatives. They speak of ramming enemy vessels with the same tone other species use for docking procedures. Counselor Zethai, representing the pacifist, ethereal collective, shimmered with distress. This suggests severe psychological dysfunction. Perhaps they require medical intervention rather than military analysis. That was our initial hypothesis, Vexhai replied. However, further investigation reveals that this behavior is not aberrant within human society. It appears to be their standard military doctrine, taught in their academies and celebrated in their culture. The display shifted again, showing intercepted human historical records, battle footage from their homeworld conflicts, training exercises, cultural entertainment, all depicting the same pattern of aggressive, self-sacrificing combat behavior. They call it heroism, Vexhai explained. Self-sacrifice in combat is not seen as tragedy, but as the highest form of honor. They create monuments to soldiers who died attacking overwhelming odds, write songs about last stands, and teach their children to admire those who chose death over retreat. High Counselor Mortek of the Titan Collective leaned forward, his crystalline form refracting the holographic light. This explains their tactical behavior, but what concerns me more is their strategic thinking. Our intelligence suggests they're actively seeking combat opportunities. Correct. Human defense doctrine is fundamentally offensive in nature. Rather than building stronger defenses, they prefer to attack threats before those threats can organize. They call it forward defense, destroying enemies in enemy territory rather than waiting for attack. The council chamber fell silent as the implications settled. Most civilized species prefer defensive strategies, building better shields, stronger fortifications, more sophisticated early warning systems. The concept of deliberately seeking out and attacking potential threats was barbaric to most galactic cultures. Counselor Yithkar spoke slowly, her translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in civilized languages. Are you saying they attack beings who have not yet attacked them? Frequently. Human military history is filled with what they call preemptive strikes. If they perceive a potential threat, they will often attack it immediately rather than waiting to see if diplomatic solutions are possible. That's Zethai's ethereal form flickered with distress. That's not warfare. That's predatory behavior. The observation was more accurate than the counselor realized. Vexhai had spent considerable time studying human evolutionary history, and the patterns were disturbing. Humanity had evolved as persistence hunters on a world filled with dangerous predators. Their ancestors had survived by being more aggressive, more adaptable, and more willing to take risks than anything else on their planet. There's another factor to consider, Vexhai continued. Human reproduction rates and social structures suggest they're optimized for conflict. They produce offspring quickly, in large numbers, and their young reach combat effectiveness faster than most species. Additionally, their social bonds actually strengthen under stress. He activated another display showing human combat units under fire. Where other species might break formation or retreat to regroup, humans moved closer together, coordinated more effectively, and fought harder when their companions were threatened. They don't just tolerate combat, he explained. In many ways, they thrive in it. Stress hormones that would incapacitate most species actually improve human performance. They become faster, stronger, and more alert when threatened. High Counselor Lormandes of the Scientific Consortium raised a tendril in inquiry. What about their technology? Surely their advancement level provides insight into their intentions. That's perhaps the most concerning aspect, Vexhai replied. Human technology development is overwhelmingly focused on two areas, transportation and weapons. They've achieved faster-than-light travel in a fraction of the time it took most species, and their weapons technology is advancing at an exponential rate. The holographic display showed human ship designs compared to equivalent vessels from other civilizations. Where most species built balanced platforms optimized for multiple roles, human ships were clearly designed with combat as the primary consideration. Notice the engine-to-mass ratios, Vexhai pointed out. Human vessels are built for speed and acceleration first, everything else second. They can reach battle positions faster than most species can detect them approaching. And their weapons? Crude, but effective. Rather than developing sophisticated targeting systems or elegant energy weapons, they focus on overwhelming firepower. They appear to believe that sufficient quantity of ordnance can solve any tactical problem. The truth was even more disturbing than Vexhai's clinical presentation suggested. Human weapons weren't just powerful, they were horrifyingly creative. Where other species developed clean, efficient energy weapons, humans seemed to delight in finding new ways to destroy things. Kinetic weapons that punched through shields, explosive devices that turned enemy ships into expanding clouds of debris, even experimental weapons that manipulated local gravity or electromagnetic fields. Counselor Mortek's crystalline structure darkened with concern. What recommendations do you have for future human contact? Vexai had anticipated this question, but he still wasn't sure how to answer it. Standard protocols for aggressive species assumed rational cost-benefit analysis. Economic sanctions worked against species that valued prosperity over conflict. Diplomatic isolation was effective against social species that needed community interaction. Military deterrence worked against species that feared death. None of these approaches seemed applicable to humans. I believe, he said carefully, that the best approach is careful engagement. Human aggression appears to be reactive rather than inherently expansionist. They respond to perceived threats, but they don't seem interested in conquest for its own sake. Perceived threats, Yithkar repeated. Who defines what constitutes a threat to humans? That's the critical question. Human threat assessment appears to be broad. They consider weapons development by other species threatening. They consider territorial expansion threatening. They consider military buildups threatening, even for defensive purposes. The implications hung in the chamber like a toxic cloud. By human standards, normal galactic politics, trade disputes backed by military posturing, territorial negotiations supported by fleet movements, technological development, including defense systems. All of this could be interpreted as threatening behavior. So our choice, Zethai said slowly, is to either appear weak enough that they ignore us, or strong enough that they consider us dangerous and attack preemptively. It would appear so. High Counselor Yithkar's mandibles clicked in what Vexai had learned to recognize as deep thought. Commander, in your professional opinion, what would happen if we attempted to contain human expansion through military means? Vexai had hoped no one would ask that question. He'd run the simulations, analyzed the probabilities, consulted with the best strategic minds in the hegemony. The answer was always the same. We would lose. Explain. Human tactical doctrine is designed specifically to defeat superior forces. They've spent their entire history fighting enemies that outnumbered them, outgunned them, or held superior positions. Our advantages, greater numbers, advanced technology, established defensive positions, are exactly the conditions they're optimized to overcome. He activated the tactical simulator, showing various engagement scenarios between human forces and hegemony fleets. In every simulation, human forces accepted devastating losses while inflicting disproportionate damage on their opponents. The economic factor alone makes victory impossible. Humans can replace their losses faster than we can. Their industrial capacity is focused on military production, their population is optimized for rapid replacement, and their psychological conditioning means they'll continue fighting long after other species would sue for peace. What about alliance warfare? Mortek asked. Surely combined hegemony forces could overwhelm even human aggression. Actually, multi-species alliances appear to be particularly vulnerable to human tactics. Our coordination protocols, translation delays, and different tactical doctrines create points of failure that humans are expert at exploiting. They've demonstrated ability to turn allied forces against each other simply by manipulating communication channels during combat. The silence that followed was profound. The assembled representatives of galactic civilization were beginning to understand what Vexai had realized months ago during that first engagement at Kepler 442c. Humanity wasn't just another aggressive species that could be contained or managed through traditional diplomacy. They were something fundamentally different, a species optimized for warfare in ways that made them nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. There is one more factor to consider, Vexai said quietly. Human expansion patterns suggest they're not interested in random conquest. They appear to be specifically seeking out and eliminating species they consider threats to general galactic stability. What do you mean? The pirate fleets at Kepler 442c weren't their first target. In the past 6 months, human forces have engaged 17 different hostile groups: raiders, slavers, rogue military units, and aggressive expansion forces. In every case, They've completely eliminated the threat rather than simply driving them off. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't expanding randomly or seeking territory for resources. They were actively hunting down and destroying anyone they perceived as dangerous to the general peace of the galaxy. They had appointed themselves as galactic police, and their version of law enforcement involved complete annihilation of criminal elements. So we have a choice, High Counselor Yithkar summarized. Accept human protection and risk their judgment of our activities, or oppose them and risk complete destruction. That appears to be correct. The council session ended without formal resolutions, but Vex High could see the decision forming in the representatives' minds. Fear was a powerful motivator, and the fear of human retaliation was beginning to outweigh traditional concerns about sovereignty and independence. As the delegates filed out, Vex High remained behind to review the data one more time. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, human ships were probably engaging another target, demonstrating once again that the universe's newest predator was also its most effective peacekeeper. The irony was almost amusing if it weren't so terrifying. 6 standard cycles had passed since Vex High's initial report to the High Council, and the galaxy had changed in ways no one had anticipated. The Zephyrian commander now held the position of Chief Human Liaison, a role that had been created specifically to manage the growing influence of Earth's children across known space. The observation deck of his new vessel, the Cultural Bridge, offered a panoramic view of the Centauri Trade Hub, one of the largest commercial centers in the galaxy. What made the view remarkable wasn't the massive space stations or the constant flow of cargo vessels, but what wasn't there. For the first time in recorded history, the trade routes were completely free of pirates, raiders, and hostile forces. The humans have been busy. Commander, came the voice of his new aide, a young Altarian named Keshvel. The human delegation has arrived for the quarterly security briefing. Vex High turned from the viewport, still adjusting to his new role. What had begun as scientific observation had evolved into something approaching diplomacy, though the relationship was unlike anything in galactic history. The humans didn't negotiate in the traditional sense. They simply informed other species of their activities and invited cooperation. The briefing room filled with representatives from various human military units. Gone were the scarred, battle-worn vessels Vex High had first observed. The human fleet had expanded exponentially, with new ships that incorporated design elements from dozens of species. They had been learning, adapting, and improving at a rate that defied conventional understanding. Admiral Chun entered the room, now wearing the insignia of the newly formed Terran peacekeeping force. Her hair was completely gray now, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had reshaped the balance of power in the galaxy through sheer force of will. "Commander Vex High," she said, settling into the specially designed chair that accommodated her smaller human frame. "Thank you for facilitating this meeting. We have several developments to discuss." The holographic display activated, showing a three-dimensional map of the galaxy with human fleet positions marked in blue, Allied forces in green, and problem areas in red. Vex High was startled to see how much blue there was. "Our latest operations have eliminated the Corvin Syndicate," Admiral Chun announced matter-of-factly, as if discussing a minor logistics issue. "Their slave trading network has been dismantled, their fleet destroyed, and their leadership structure completely eliminated." Vex High felt a familiar chill. The Corvin Syndicate had been one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy, with enough firepower to threaten entire star systems. They had operated for over a century, survived multiple hegemony attempts at containment, and seemed virtually untouchable. "How long did the operation take?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. 17 hours from initial engagement to complete elimination of all hostile forces," Admiral Chen replied. "We lost 2 ships and 37 personnel. Acceptable losses for the scope of the operation." Acceptable losses. Vex High had learned to recognize this phrase as the most terrifying statement humans could make. It meant they had weighed the cost and lives against their objectives, and decided the deaths were worthwhile. No other species made such calculations so casually. What about survivors? Prisoners? Surely there were non-combatants involved in the syndicate operations? Non-combatants were evacuated to safe zones before engagement began. Combatants were given one opportunity to surrender unconditionally. Those who refused were eliminated. Those who surrendered are being processed through the rehabilitation program. The rehabilitation program was another uniquely human innovation. Rather than imprisonment or execution, captured criminals were subjected to intensive psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their antisocial behaviors. The process was voluntary, but the alternative was lifetime isolation on prison worlds. Most chose rehabilitation. The next item, Admiral Chun continued, involves the Hegemony Council's recent military expansion in the Outer Rim territories. Vexhai felt his circulatory system slow. This was exactly the kind of development he had been dreading. The Hegemony had been building new defensive platforms in response to increased pirate activity, but human threat assessment protocols didn't distinguish between defensive and offensive military buildups. Admiral, those installations are purely defensive in nature. The Council has no aggressive intentions toward human territories or operations. We understand the stated purpose, Admiral Chen replied, her tone neutral, but somehow ominous. However, the weapon systems being installed are capable of offensive operations against civilian targets. This presents an unacceptable risk to regional stability. What do you recommend? The installations will be modified to remove offensive capability, or they will be eliminated. The Council has 72 hours to decide which option they prefer. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even an ultimatum in the traditional sense. Admiral Chun was simply informing him of a decision that had already been made. If the Hegemony didn't voluntarily disarm their defensive installations, the humans would destroy them. Admiral, surely there's some middle ground here. Perhaps international observers or restrictions on the types of weapons. Commander, Admiral Chun interrupted gently. Let me explain something about human strategic thinking. We don't believe in proportional response or gradual escalation. When we identify a threat, we eliminate it completely and permanently. It's more efficient than managing ongoing risks. She activated another display showing recent human operations against various hostile forces. In every case, the pattern was the same: overwhelming force applied until the target was completely destroyed. No survivors, no remnants, no possibility of the threat resurging. But this approach must create new enemies, Vexhai protested. Surely other species will unite against human expansion out of fear. That's a common misconception, Admiral Chen replied. Fear is only effective as a motivator when the threatened party believes they have a chance of success. Our policy is to demonstrate clearly that resistance is futile, so potential enemies choose cooperation instead. The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. Humans didn't try to minimize conflict through diplomacy or deterrence. Instead, they made conflict so costly that no rational actor would choose it. The few irrational actors who did choose conflict were eliminated so thoroughly that they served as examples to everyone else. There is another matter, Admiral Chen continued. We've detected unusual energy signatures from the Andromeda contact zone. Our analysis suggests the possibility of extragalactic hostile forces. Vexhai's four arms moved involuntarily in a gesture of distress. The Andromeda contact zone was the frontier where galactic civilization met the vast emptiness between galaxies. It had always been assumed that nothing dangerous could exist in such a void. What kind of hostile forces? Unknown. The energy signatures don't match any known technology, and the power levels are orders of magnitude beyond current galactic capabilities. We're dispatching the Fourth Fleet to investigate. The Fourth Fleet consisted of 200 human warships, each one a technological marvel that incorporated the best innovations from every species in the galaxy. It was enough firepower to sterilize entire star systems. Yet Admiral Chen spoke of it as a mere scouting mission. What if these forces are peaceful? What if they're refugees or explorers, or then they'll have nothing to fear from our investigation, Admiral Chun said simply. But if they represent a threat to galactic civilization, they'll be dealt with accordingly. Vexhai realized he was witnessing the transformation of humanity from a single species into something unprecedented, a galactic hegemon that ruled through demonstrated superiority rather than political manipulation. They didn't conquer territory or subjugate populations. They simply eliminated anything they perceived as dangerous and left everyone else alone to prosper under their protection. Admiral, may I ask a personal question? Of course. Don't you ever worry that you might be wrong? That your threat assessments might lead you to destroy something innocent? Admiral Chun was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since he'd known her, Vexhai saw something like uncertainty in her expression. Every day, she admitted. But the alternative is worse. We've studied galactic history, Commander. Thousands of civilizations destroyed by wars that could have been prevented if someone had been willing to act decisively against emerging threats. Billions of sentient beings enslaved or killed because their defenders chose negotiation over elimination of hostile forces. She stood and moved to the viewport, looking out at the peaceful trade hub beyond. We made a choice as a species. We'd rather be wrong and alive than right and dead. And we'd rather carry the guilt of excessive action than the guilt of insufficient action. The briefing ended shortly afterward, but Vexhai remained in the room long after the humans had departed. Outside, merchant ships from dozens of species moved freely through space that had been a war zone just cycles ago. Trade was flourishing, exploration was expanding, and scientific cooperation had reached unprecedented levels. The cost was freedom, not political freedom, but the freedom to threaten others. Under human protection, every species could develop peacefully, but none could build the military forces necessary to threaten their neighbors. It was a form of enforced pacifism that had brought peace to the galaxy for the first time in recorded history. As Vexhai prepared his report to the Hegemony Council, he reflected on the irony of the situation. The most violent species in galactic history had become the guardians of peace, and their methods, however terrifying, were undeniably effective. The universe had feared humanity's capacity for destruction, but it had underestimated their capacity for protection. They fought not for conquest or glory, but for the simple principle that those who threatened innocence should not be allowed to continue existing. In the end, perhaps the universe didn't need to fear humans after all. It needed to fear what would happen if humans ever decided to stop protecting it. Vexhai's final report contained a single recommendation that would reshape galactic policy for generations to come. Accept human protection unconditionally. The alternative is a return to the chaos that humanity has eliminated from our civilization. Whatever the cost of their methods, it is infinitely preferable to the cost of their absence. The galaxy had found its guardians. Whether it wanted them or not was no longer relevant.